I didn't think a kid's bike could be the thing that finally broke something in my family, but looking back, it makes a depressing amount of sense. I'm Clark, I'm 36, and until a few weeks ago I genuinely believed that if I kept my head down, stayed reasonable, and did the mature thing, eventually my family would meet me halfway. I was wrong. The bike was just the moment when the disrespect stopped being subtle enough to ignore. My son, Noah, turned 7 this year. He's the kind of kid who counts down to his birthday like it's a major life event, not just a day. Every morning for weeks he'd wake up and say, "Only 12 more days," then, "Only 11. Like he was tracking a rocket launch. He doesn't ask for much. He's careful with his toys, says thank you without being prompted, and still gets genuinely excited over things most kids his age take for granted. A few months before his birthday, he saw a red bike with black handlebars in a store window while we were walking home from school. He stopped so suddenly, I nearly walked into him. He just stared at it, hands in his jacket pockets, rocking on his heels. "Dad," he said quietly, "that's the one I like." He didn't ask for it. He just said he liked it. That alone made me decide. I picked up extra shifts for a few weeks and ordered the bike online so he wouldn't see it early. I hid it in my garage behind a stack of boxes labeled with old tax years, the kind no one ever opens. Every time I went out there, I'd peel back the cardboard a little and picture his face. I don't get many moments where I feel like I'm really nailing this whole parent thing, but that bike felt like one of them. Family birthdays in my world are rarely just about the person whose birthday it is. They're group events, controlled almost entirely by my parents. Same house, same food, same seating arrangement. My older brother Ryan and his wife usually arrive late and loud, with their 8-year-old son in tow. Ryan has always had a way of filling a room, not with warmth, but with certainty. Certainty that he's right, that his opinion is the reasonable one, that if there's tension, someone else caused it. Growing up, he was the golden child. Better grades, better sports, better job, better house. I was the steady one, dependable, flexible, the one who was expected to adapt. The first hint that Noah's birthday was going to be another reminder of that came when my mom called a week before the party. She asked, casually, whether we could keep gifts modest this year because Ryan's kid had been feeling a little sensitive about comparisons. I remember holding the phone away from my ear and just staring at the wall for a second. I said, "It's Noah's birthday. He's 7. She sighed the way she does when she thinks I'm being difficult and said, "I know, Clark, but you know how Ryan's family is right now. Let's just keep things balanced." I told her fine, mostly because I didn't want to have the argument then. I should have pushed back. I didn't. The morning of the party, Noah bounced around the kitchen like he was plugged into a socket. I told him we had a surprise later, and he spent the next hour guessing wildly. Dinosaur? Video game? A trip somewhere? I let him spiral because I wanted that reveal to land. When we loaded the bike into the back of my car, I covered it with a blanket and told him not to peek. He put his hands over his eyes dramatically and promised he wouldn't. My parents' house was already loud when we arrived. Ryan's car was there, trunk open, music playing too loudly for a residential street. He waved at me with the same half-smile he always uses, like he's greeting a coworker he doesn't particularly respect. "Hey man," he said, "you're late." We were 5 minutes early. The party itself started fine. Cake on the counter, balloons taped slightly crooked to the wall, my dad already stationed near the grill like it was his post. Noah opened a few small gifts from my parents and some relatives. Socks, a book, a board game. He smiled and said thank you every time. He kept glancing toward the driveway, waiting for whatever I'd hinted at. When I finally brought the bike around from the garage, I felt that swell in my chest parents talk about. I wheeled it in slowly, ringing the bell once. Noah froze, then his mouth fell open. He didn't scream. He didn't jump. He just stared at it, eyes wide, like he was afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. "Is that?" he whispered. I nodded. He hugged me so hard, I almost lost my balance. That should have been the end of it. A kid, a bike, a good memory. Instead, I noticed Ryan watching from the corner of the room, his smile tight. His son had gone quiet too, staring at the bike with a look I'd seen before. The look that said, someone else has something I don't, and that needs to be fixed. Ryan walked over, crouched down next to the bike, and gave it a once-over like he was inspecting a used car. "Wow," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's a pretty serious bike." He looked at me. Didn't we talk about keeping things simple this year? I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice even. It's his birthday, Ryan. He shrugged. Yeah, but you know how kids are. Comparisons. Feelings get hurt. He ruffled his son's hair. Right, buddy? His son didn't say anything. He just kept staring at the bike. My mom cleared her throat and said something about cutting the cake. The moment passed, or so I thought. I spent the next half hour watching Noah ride slow circles in the driveway, laughing every time the bell rang. I relaxed a little. Maybe that was it. Maybe Ryan would grumble later and move on. I was inside getting plates when I heard the front door open and close again. I looked out the window just in time to see Ryan lifting the bike into the back of his SUV. For a split second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then I was out the door, heart pounding, asking what he thought he was doing. He didn't even look surprised. He just straightened up, dusted off his hands, and said, "Relax. I'm taking it to my place. My kid's clearly upset, and it's not fair to rub it in. You can buy another." That was the moment something in me shifted. Not exploded, not snapped loudly, just shifted like a plate sliding under pressure. I looked past him and saw Noah standing on the porch, confused, his hands clenched into fists, trying very hard not to cry. I opened my mouth to argue, to shout, to demand he put it back. Instead, I closed it. I nodded once. Ryan smirked, satisfied, like he'd just resolved a minor inconvenience. Inside, my phone started buzzing. One missed call from my mom. Then another. Then my dad. I watched Ryan drive away with my son's birthday gift in his trunk, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry enough to yell. I felt calm, cold, and very aware that this wasn't just about a bike anymore. I didn't chase Ryan's car. I didn't shout after him. I stood there in my parents' driveway with my hands hanging uselessly at my sides while Noah stared at the empty space where his bike had been. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then my mom came up behind me and put a hand on my arm, the way she does when she thinks she's being soothing. "Clark," she said softly, "let's not make a scene. The kids can sense tension." I turned and looked at her. I remember noticing how calm she seemed, how quickly she'd settled into this version of events where nothing outrageous had just happened. "He took my son's birthday gift," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flatter than I expected. "He just took it." She frowned, like I'd phrased something incorrectly. "He's just borrowing it. You heard him. You can get another one. It's not the end of the world." Noah tugged on my sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, his lip trembling. "Did I do something wrong?" That was the moment the anger finally reached my chest. I crouched down and told him no, absolutely not, that none of this was his fault. I promised him we'd figure it out. He nodded, trying to be brave, but his eyes kept drifting toward the driveway, like he was hoping the bike would roll back on its own. The rest of the party felt surreal. Cake was cut. Plates were passed around. People talked about work, about weather, about a neighbor's new fence. No one brought up the bike again. Not once. It was like a collective agreement had been reached that if we didn't name it, it wasn't real. Ryan's absence barely registered. My dad made a joke about kids these days and laughed alone. I watched Noah push his cake around with a fork, appetite gone, and I felt something ugly settling in my stomach. When we finally left, my mom hugged Noah and told him she'd see him soon. She hugged me too, a little tighter, and whispered, "Don't be stubborn about this, Clark. Family is more important than things." I didn't respond. I buckled Noah into his seat and drove home in silence. That night, Noah asked if he could sleep in my bed. He hadn't done that in years. He curled up next to me and asked, very quietly, if his cousin needed the bike more because he was better. I told him no. I told him sometimes adults make bad choices and don't realize how much they hurt people. I told him he was loved. He fell asleep clutching my shirt like it was an anchor. I lay awake for hours, replaying the scene in my head. The casual way Ryan had lifted the bike. The way my parents had immediately closed ranks around him. This wasn't new. It just finally had a face I couldn't look away from anymore. The next morning, my phone was already buzzing before I finished my coffee. A text from my mom asking if I'd cooled down. A missed call from my dad. Another text from Ryan. No hard feelings. Kids are kids. You know how it is. I typed out half a dozen responses and deleted all of them. Instead, I sent one message. "I want the bike back today." There was a long pause. Then Ryan replied, "Let's talk later." "You're being dramatic." Later never came. By the afternoon, It was clear he had no intention of returning anything. When I called him, it went straight to voicemail. When I called my parents, my mom answered and immediately went into mediator mode. She told me Ryan's son had already gotten attached. That taking it back now would cause unnecessary trauma. She asked me why I was so fixated on an object when I could easily replace it. Because it wasn't yours to give away, I said. Because it wasn't Ryan's to take. She sighed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself in smaller, quieter ways. Ryan posted a picture of his son riding the bike on social media, captioned with something about sharing is caring. My mom liked it. My dad commented with a thumbs up. No one mentioned Noah. At dinner one night, Noah asked if we could go to the park and ride his bike. I told him not tonight. He nodded, too quickly, and went back to his food. I hated myself for not fixing it immediately, for letting this stretch out. But there was something else happening under the surface now. Something heavier than just getting the bike back. The breaking point didn't come as one big explosion. It came as a slow accumulation of moments that made it impossible to pretend anymore. A week later, my parents hosted another family dinner. I almost didn't go, but Noah wanted to see his grandparents, and I didn't want him to feel like he was losing more than he already had. Ryan and his family were there too. The bike was parked prominently by the front door, like a trophy. Ryan grinned when he saw me looking at it. See, he said. He loves it. I felt my hands curl into fists. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to pick my battles. Dinner started with small talk and ended, inevitably, with family business. My dad cleared his throat and said they'd been talking about finances, about how things were getting tighter, about how it might be time for everyone to pitch in more equally. I already knew where this was going. My mom turned to me and smiled. Clark, since you're the most stable right now, we were hoping you could help cover some of Ryan's expenses for a bit, just until things even out. I stared at her. What expenses? Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You know, kids' activities, some upgrades around the house, stuff like that. I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. You took my kid's birthday gift, and now you want me to help pay for your house. Don't twist things, my mom said sharply. This has nothing to do with the bike. It has everything to do with it, I said. You keep taking from me because you think I won't push back. The table went quiet. My dad's face hardened. Watch your tone. That was when Ryan stood up and did something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and slid it across the table toward me. Since we're airing things out, he said, maybe you should see this. On the screen was a screenshot of a group chat I wasn't part of. Messages from my parents. Messages from Ryan. Talking about me. About how I was too sensitive. About how Noah would get over it. About how I was good for support, but not leadership. About how they'd planned to let Ryan keep the bike from the start because it would be easier than dealing with Clark's emotions. My mom went pale. My dad looked away. Ryan shrugged. You were always the reliable one. We figured you'd understand. Noah was sitting right next to me, quietly coloring, unaware that something fundamental had just cracked open. I looked at the messages again, at the weeks of casual dismissal, and felt something settle into place. Not rage. Not grief. Clarity. I slid the phone back across the table. I stood up slowly, put my hand on Noah's shoulder, and told him we were going home. My mom started to protest. My dad told me to sit down and not be dramatic. Ryan smirked, confident he'd won whatever this was. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just left. As I buckled Noah into the car, my phone started ringing. My mom. Then my dad. Then Ryan. One after the other. I watched the screen light up and go dark and light up again. And for the first time, I didn't feel like answering. Because somewhere between that driveway and that dinner table, I'd stopped trying to be understood. And I'd started thinking about what it would actually take to make this stop. The first few days after that dinner felt like walking around with a low-grade fever. Everything technically worked, but nothing felt right. I went to work, answered emails, made dinner, helped Noah with homework. On the outside, I looked functional. On the inside, I was replaying that group chat over and over, like my brain was trying to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The words were burned into me. Not leadership material. Too sensitive. Good for support. The kind of things people say when they've already decided what box you belong in. My parents didn't stop calling. They left voicemails that swung wildly between concern and irritation. My mom cried in one message, said she didn't recognize me anymore, said I was tearing the family apart over something small. My dad's messages were shorter, more controlled. He told me to be rational, to think about the bigger picture, to stop punishing everyone because of my pride. Ryan didn't apologize. He sent one message 2 days later. You overreacted. Let's reset. No mention of the bike. No mention of the messages. Just a suggestion that I swallow it and move on like I always had. I didn't respond to any of them. That silence cost me more than I expected. My parents stopped inviting Noah over. When I asked why, my mom said they needed space and didn't want to confuse him. Ryan told extended family that I was going through something and needed time. An aunt messaged me asking if I was okay financially. A cousin joked that I'd finally snapped after years of being the responsible one. I realized, slowly and painfully, that a version of me had been circulating without my input for a long time. The lowest point came about a week later. Noah came home from school quieter than usual. After dinner, he sat at the table long after his plate was empty, tracing circles in a crumb with his finger. Finally, he asked if his grandparents were mad at him. I told him no, of course not. He nodded, then asked if his cousin still had the bike. I said yes. He swallowed hard and said, "It's okay. I guess some kids just need things more." I went into the bathroom and closed the door and just stood there, staring at myself in the mirror. That sentence felt like a verdict. Not on Ryan. Not on my parents. On me. Somewhere along the way, I had taught my son that being taken from was normal. That fairness was flexible. That his disappointment was something to manage quietly so other people could stay comfortable. That night, after Noah went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table until the house was silent and made a decision I should have made years earlier. I stopped trying to fix the relationship and started focusing on repairing the damage it had already done. The first thing I did was small. I blocked the group chat messages from my parents so I wouldn't see their names light up my phone every time they decided to check in. I sent one text, carefully worded, telling them I needed space and would reach out when I was ready. My mom replied immediately with a paragraph about how hurt she was. I didn't answer. Then I did something that felt almost rebellious. I bought Noah another bike. Not the same model. A different one. Blue this time, with thicker tires. I didn't make a big announcement. I just brought it home one afternoon and wheeled it into the garage like it was no big deal. When I showed him, he smiled, but there was a hesitation there I hadn't seen before, like he was waiting for someone to take it away. I told him gently, clearly, that this one was his, that no one else got to decide what happened to it. He nodded, still cautious, but when he rode it the first time, he laughed. Really laughed. That sound felt like oxygen. Rebuilding didn't happen all at once. It happened in quiet moments. I started saying no more often. Not dramatically, just calmly. When my mom asked if I could cover something for Ryan, just this once, I said no. When an uncle suggested I smooth things over because that's just how Ryan is, I said I wasn't interested. The world didn't end. People were annoyed. Some were confused. But nothing catastrophic happened. That alone was eye-opening. I also took a hard look at my own life, separate from them. For years, I defined stability as not rocking the boat, as being the one everyone could lean on. I realized how little of that stability had actually been for me. I took on extra projects at work I'd been avoiding because they felt risky. I signed up for a leadership course my manager had suggested months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. The guy labeled not leadership material was suddenly being told, by people outside my family, that I had potential. Noah noticed the changes too. He asked why we didn't see his grandparents as much anymore. I told him the truth, in age-appropriate pieces, that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people, and it's okay to step back until they can be kinder. He thought about that and said, like timeout. I laughed and said yes. Exactly like timeout. The rise wasn't loud. There were no dramatic confrontations or speeches. There was just a growing sense that I didn't have to earn my place by being useful, that I could be enough without constantly giving things away. A month passed, then another. My parents tried a different tactic. They sent gifts for Noah through the mail. They showed up at his school event without telling me. They left notes saying they missed us and didn't understand why I was being so distant. Ryan sent another message, this one sharper, accusing me of poisoning Noah against the family. I saved it and didn't reply. The shock came one afternoon when my dad showed up at my door unannounced. He looked smaller somehow, older. He asked if we could talk. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He said they were worried, that the family felt fractured, that Ryan was struggling and needed support. I listened without interrupting. Then I told him I wasn't discussing Ryan anymore, that my focus was my son, that if they wanted a relationship with us, it would be on different terms. He asked what those terms were. I told him we'd talk about that later. Not now. That was the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. After he left, I sat on the couch and realized something important. The fear that had kept me compliant for so long had finally loosened its grip. I wasn't at rock bottom anymore. I wasn't even climbing for their approval. I was building something quieter, sturdier, without them at the center. I didn't know yet how far I was willing to go. I didn't know what lines I would draw next. But I knew one thing for certain. The next move wouldn't be about a bike. It would be about making sure no one ever felt entitled to take from my son again. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a plan was starting to take shape. By the time I admitted to myself that what I was doing wasn't just healing, but preparing, the groundwork had already been laid. I didn't wake up one morning thinking about revenge. That word still felt dramatic, even dishonest, for what I had in mind. What I wanted was balance, accountability, and into the quiet assumption that whatever belonged to me, or to my son, was available to be redistributed if Ryan felt like it and my parents decided it was easier that way. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself. I'd spent years giving context, offering justifications, softening my boundaries so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Now, when my mom asked why I wasn't bringing Noah over, I simply said, because I don't trust that his things or his feelings will be respected. When she protested, I repeated it. No added emotion. No stories. Just the truth, clean and uncomfortable. She didn't like that. I could tell because she stopped asking follow-up questions and started talking around the issue instead. The second thing I did was start paying attention, not in a paranoid way, but in the way you do when you finally stop assuming everyone has good intentions. I listened when relatives talked. I noticed patterns I'd ignored before. Ryan borrowing things and never returning them. My parents quietly covering for him. Stories about money moving hands without paperwork. Casual comments about assets being family property, even when one name was clearly on the documents. I also stopped shielding Noah from everything. Not dumping adult problems on him, but modeling something different. When he asked why we weren't going to Grandma's house, I didn't say we were busy. I said, because Grandma and Grandpa made some choices that weren't kind to us, and until that changes, we're keeping our distance. He accepted that more easily than I expected. Kids understand fairness better than adults give them credit for. The real shift happened when I ran into my cousin Mark at the grocery store. Mark had always been on the fringes of family gatherings. Quiet, observant, the kind of person people underestimate because he doesn't fight for attention. He asked how Noah was doing, then hesitated, then said, I heard about the bike. I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. People talk. We ended up grabbing coffee, and without me prompting him, Mark started listing things. Times Ryan had taken advantage. Moments my parents had intervened on his behalf. He said something that stuck with me. They get away with it because everyone thinks it's easier not to push back. You're the first one who actually did. That conversation was like a confirmation. I wasn't imagining the imbalance. It wasn't just my hurt talking. Other people had seen it too. They just hadn't wanted to be the ones to challenge it. After that, I started having more of those conversations. Quiet ones. With relatives who'd learned to keep their heads down. With an aunt who admitted she'd lent Ryan money years ago and never gotten it back. With a family friend who mentioned, casually, that my parents had been telling people Ryan was managing some things for them financially, even though my dad had always been meticulous about control. I didn't push. I didn't interrogate. I just listened. At the same time, I tightened my own life. I updated my will. I named guardians. I made sure every account, every asset, every document was clear and protected. It wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be no confusion about what belonged to Noah and who had no claim to it. Ryan noticed the change before anyone else. He called me one evening, his tone falsely casual, and asked why I'd gone cold. I told him I hadn't. I'd just stopped pretending things were fine when they weren't. He laughed and said I was being dramatic again. Then he said something that confirmed everything I needed to know. You know, Mom and Dad are really disappointed in how you're handling this. They thought you'd come around by now. I thanked him for letting me know and ended the call. That was when I realized how much they'd underestimated me. They were waiting for the old pattern to reassert itself. for me to feel guilty, to doubt myself, to worry about being labeled the difficult one. They didn't see what was happening beneath the surface because they'd never bothered to look closely before. The opportunity I'd been quietly waiting for arrived in an unexpected way. My mom called and said they were thinking of hosting a big family gathering. A reset, she called it. Something to bring everyone back together. She said Ryan had suggested it, that he wanted to clear the air. She asked if Noah and I would come. I told her I'd think about it. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. This was the moment. Not the confrontation itself, but the setting. A space where they'd feel confident. Where they'd expect me to play my old role. Where witnesses would be present. I didn't know exactly what shape things would take yet, but I knew this was the opening. I agreed to attend, with conditions. No surprises. No taking Noah's things. No private conversations that could be twisted later. My mom agreed quickly, too quickly, like she was just relieved I hadn't said no outright. In the days leading up to it, my parents' calls increased. So did Ryan's. He sent messages about moving on, about how families fight, but always come back together. He even mentioned the bike once, saying his son had really bonded with it, but maybe, eventually, they could work something out. The audacity of that phrasing almost made me laugh. Instead, I said nothing. I spent those days preparing in quieter ways. Printing things. Organizing timelines. Making sure I remembered exact words, exact dates. Not because I planned to ambush anyone with documents, but because I refused to let my experience be rewritten again. If they tried to minimize, to deny, to soften what had happened, I wanted my footing solid. The night before the gathering, Noah asked if he had to go. I told him no, that this was my choice, not his. He thought about it and said he trusted me. That trust felt heavier than any anger I'd carried before. It made everything else feel small by comparison. As I drove to my parents' house the next day, I felt strangely calm. No shaking hands. No racing thoughts. Just a clear awareness that whatever happened next would change things permanently. I wasn't walking in to plead. I wasn't walking in to explode. I was walking in with my eyes open. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Inside that house, they were expecting the old version of me. The accommodating one. The one who would listen, nod, and eventually give in. They had no idea how much ground had already shifted beneath them. And as I reached for the door, I realized this wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about making sure that when I walked out again, there would be no doubt left about where I stood and what I was no longer willing to tolerate. I walked into my parents' house expecting resistance, maybe denial, maybe tears. What I didn't expect was how confident everyone looked. The living room was full. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Ryan was leaned back in his chair like he owned the place, his wife beside him, their son playing on the floor with a toy car. The bike wasn't visible, but I didn't need to see it to know where it was. My mom greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My dad clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good. You came. Let's finally put this behind us." That phrase hit me differently than it would have a few months earlier. Put this behind us. It assumed the outcome before the conversation even started. It assumed I'd come to be convinced. We sat. Small talk filled the room. People asked about work. About Noah. I answered politely and kept my responses short. I noticed how often Ryan cut in, how often my parents looked to him for cues. The old dynamic was still there, humming under the surface, confident it would reassert itself. Eventually, my mom cleared her throat and said this gathering was about healing. About family. About not letting misunderstandings turn into permanent rifts. She looked directly at me when she said misunderstandings. Ryan nodded solemnly, like a man prepared to forgive. I let her finish. I let the silence stretch after she stopped talking. Then I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pace. I didn't gesture dramatically. I just stood there and said, before we talk about healing, I need to be very clear about what actually happened. Ryan rolled his eyes. My dad shifted in his seat. I started with the bike. Not emotionally. Factually. I said when I bought it. How much it cost. Where it was stored. How it was presented to Noah. I described Ryan loading it into his car. I repeated his exact words. You can buy another. I talked about Noah asking if he'd done something wrong. I talked about my mom telling me not to make a scene. No embellishment. No insults. Just events. Ryan laughed once and said, "We've been over this." I looked at him and said, "I'm not done." Then I moved on to the messages. I didn't show the screenshots yet. I just summarized. I quoted phrases. Too sensitive. Not leadership material. Easier than dealing with Clark's emotions. I watched faces change as people realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. My mom interrupted, voice shaking, and said those messages were private, that they were taken out of context, that families say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. I nodded. That may be true, I said. But what you meant showed in what you did. Not just what you said. That was when I pulled out the folder I'd brought with me. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just organized. I explained that while I'd been taking space, I'd also been paying attention. I talked about money Ryan had borrowed and never repaid. About expenses my parents had quietly covered for him. About how often I'd been asked to contribute temporarily to situations that somehow never resolved. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. Calm ones. Specific ones. Ryan finally snapped. He stood up and said I was attacking him in front of everyone. That I was jealous. That I'd always resented him. My dad told him to sit down, then told me I was crossing a line. I said no, I'm finally drawing one. Then I did the thing they weren't expecting. I told them I wasn't there to argue about the past. I was there to explain the future. I told them that as of that moment, I was done providing financial support to Ryan in any form. No loans. No covering gaps. No emergencies that somehow always landed on me. I told my parents that any relationship with Noah would happen on my terms. No unsupervised visits. No gifts that came with expectations. No access to his belongings. I told them that the bike needed to be returned by the end of the week, not as a favor, but because it never belonged to Ryan to begin with. Ryan laughed again and said, "Or what?" I looked at him and said, "Or you can keep explaining to everyone why you think stealing from a child is acceptable." The room went very quiet. My aunt spoke up first. She asked Ryan if it was true he still had the bike. He hesitated. That hesitation said more than any accusation could. Another relative asked about the money. Someone else asked why they'd never heard my side before. The narrative started to crack, not because I attacked it, but because I stepped out of it and let the truth sit there on its own. My mom started crying. My dad looked tired. Ryan looked angry, but underneath that, I saw something else for the first time. Uncertainty. He'd never had to defend himself like this before. Not without my parents immediately stepping in. I told them one last thing before I left. I said I loved my family, but love didn't mean unlimited access. It didn't mean silence. It didn't mean teaching my son that his feelings were less important than keeping adults comfortable. I said if they wanted to rebuild, it would be slow, and it would require change. Real change. Not apologies followed by the same behavior. Then I walked out. The fallout came faster than I expected. The bike was returned 2 days later, left on my driveway without a note. Ryan didn't come with it. My mom called and apologized, not perfectly, but honestly. She admitted she'd favored Ryan because it felt easier than confronting him. My dad took longer, but eventually acknowledged that he'd let things slide for the sake of peace. Ryan didn't apologize. He sent a message saying I'd embarrassed him. I didn't reply. Over the next few months, the family dynamic shifted. Invitations became more cautious. Conversations more careful. Some relatives distanced themselves from Ryan. Others reached out to me quietly and said they were glad someone had finally said something. My parents saw Noah less often, but when they did, they were attentive in a way they hadn't been before. Respectful. Careful. Like they understood they were no longer entitled to him. The biggest change, though, was at home. Noah rode his bike every day. The blue one. The one that was his. He stopped asking questions that broke my heart. He stopped shrinking himself. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun go down, he said, "Dad, I like how you didn't let them take my stuff again." I told him, "Me too. I don't know what the long-term future looks like with my family. Some bridges can be rebuilt. Some shouldn't be. What I do know is this. I stopped being the person everyone leaned on because I was easy to take from. I became the person who stood still and said no more. And the funny thing is, the moment I did that, I didn't lose myself. I finally found him. The first time my parents told me, money isn't everything. It was said with this calm, almost rehearsed disappointment, like they were imparting some ancient wisdom instead of brushing off the fact that I was barely keeping my head above water. I remember the exact moment because I was sitting at their kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, trying to figure out how to explain that I wasn't asking for luxury or handouts. I was asking for a little understanding. My name's Dean. I'm 32 now, But at the time of this story, I was 31 and already felt about 10 years older than that. Life had a way of doing that to me. I've always been the responsible one in my family. Not the favorite, not the loud one, not the one everyone bragged about at gatherings. Just the reliable background character. The one who moved out early, paid his own bills, didn't ask for help, and quietly assumed that if I did everything right, things would eventually balance out. My parents loved to talk about how independent I was. They used that word like a compliment, but it slowly turned into an excuse. Independent meant I didn't need support. Independent meant I could handle it. Independent meant they didn't have to worry about me. 6 months before everything exploded, I was in a rough spot financially. Not dramatic, movie-style broke, but the kind that creeps up on you. Rising rent, a car that decided to develop a personality disorder, medical bills from an issue I'd ignored too long because I didn't want to spend the money. I was working full-time, picking up extra freelance hours at night, and still watching my account dip into uncomfortable territory by the end of every month. I wasn't irresponsible. I was just tired and scared, and finally desperate enough to talk to my parents about it. I didn't even ask them for money outright. That's the part that still sticks with me. I told them I was stressed, that I might need to make some tough decisions soon, like moving farther from work or selling my car. I thought maybe they'd say something supportive. Instead, my dad leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Dean, you worry too much about money. Money isn't everything." My mom nodded like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "You've always been so focused on finances. You need to relax. Things work themselves out." I remember forcing a smile and nodding along, even though inside I felt this quiet, sinking frustration. Easy to say when your mortgage is paid off and your biggest expense is a yearly vacation. I left that day feeling smaller than when I arrived, like I'd failed some unspoken test by even bringing it up. Here's the thing about my family dynamic. It looks functional from the outside. No screaming matches at holidays. No dramatic estrangements. Just layers of subtle favoritism and expectations that everyone pretends not to see. I have a younger sister, Melissa, who's 28. She's always been taken care of. If she needed help, it was framed as support. If I needed help, it was framed as weakness. My parents would never admit that, but patterns don't lie. Melissa moved back home after college, temporarily. That temporary situation lasted for years. They covered her car insurance, helped with her student loans, and brushed it off with, "She's still finding herself." When I moved out at 19, my dad shook my hand like I was joining the military. Different standards. Same household. So when 6 months passed after that kitchen table conversation, I honestly thought the whole "money isn't everything" speech was behind us. I was grinding through it, slowly stabilizing, still stressed, but managing. Then my mom called me one evening and said, "Your father and I need to talk to you. Can you come over tomorrow? It's important." That word, important, should have been my first warning. I showed up the next night, expecting maybe a family discussion about holidays or something related to Melissa. Instead, they had that serious posture people get when they've already decided something and just need you to accept it. My dad gestured for me to sit. My mom clasped her hands together like she was bracing herself. "We're going to need your help with something," my mom started. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. "Okay, what kind of help?" They exchanged a look. My dad cleared his throat. "Your sister is planning a big step in her life." That alone could have meant anything. Moving out. A new job. A relationship. I nodded, waiting. "She's finally ready to buy a place," my mom said, smiling like this was a shared victory. "It's a great opportunity." I did some quick mental math. Housing prices were insane. Melissa didn't exactly have a stellar savings record. "That's good for her," I said carefully. "And," my dad continued, "we've decided as a family to make sure she doesn't miss this chance." There it was. That phrase. As a family. My mom leaned forward. "This is non-negotiable," she said gently, like she was talking to a child. "We need you to contribute." I actually laughed, because I thought she had to be joking. "Contribute how?" My dad said it like it was obvious. "Financially." I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. None came. "You can afford it," my mom added, almost casually. That sentence landed harder than anything else they'd said. You can afford it. After months of telling me money wasn't everything. After dismissing my stress. After watching me juggle and sacrifice in silence. Suddenly, my finances were very much their business, and apparently, their resource. I tried to explain, calmly at first. I told them I was still recovering financially, that I was finally getting some breathing room, but nowhere near comfortable. My dad frowned, disappointed. Dean, this isn't about comfort. It's about family. My mom sighed. You're always so focused on what you don't have. Look at the bigger picture. I felt heat creeping up my neck, that mix of anger and disbelief that makes it hard to find the right words. They talked like this was a small favor, like they hadn't just decided, without asking, that my role was to fill in the financial gaps for decisions I had no say in. How much are we talking about? I asked. They told me the number. And that's where my stomach dropped, because it wasn't a few hundred. It wasn't even a few thousand. It was the kind of amount that would erase every bit of progress I'd made and shove me right back into survival mode. Also, Melissa could have a nicer place. Also, my parents could feel generous without actually stretching themselves. I remember sitting there, nodding slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Not explode yet, just crack. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't about money at all. It was about entitlement, about expectations, about the role they'd quietly assigned me years ago without ever asking if I agreed to play it. And as they kept talking about deadlines, about what Melissa deserved, about how proud they were of her, I felt this cold clarity settle in. They thought this was done, decided, non-negotiable. I didn't argue with them that night. That's the part people always find strange when I tell this story later. They expect shouting, slammed doors, some dramatic speech. Instead, I sat there quietly while my parents talked through numbers, timelines, and expectations like they were discussing a shared household expense instead of volunteering my future. I nodded when appropriate. I asked neutral questions. I even said, "Let me think about it," which my mom translated immediately into agreement. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation over and over. Not just the words, but the tone, the certainty. The way "you can afford it" had been delivered as fact, not opinion. They hadn't asked if I was willing. They hadn't asked what it would cost me personally. They decided, and now my role was to comply. That night, I barely slept. I lay there staring at the ceiling, doing math in my head, wondering which bills I could delay, which plans I'd have to cancel, how many months it would take to recover if I actually went through with it. And underneath all of that was something heavier than stress. It was the realization that my parents genuinely believed my resources were available to them. Not borrowed. Not requested. Available. The next morning, Melissa texted me. "Mom said you're helping with the place. Thank you." 3 exclamation points. No question mark. No, "Are you okay with this?" Just confirmation that the decision had already traveled down the family line as settled fact. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with something neutral. "We still need to talk about details." She replied with a thumbs-up emoji, and Dad said it's handled. That was the first real crack. Because if my own sister believed this was handled, it meant the narrative had already been framed without me in the room. I wasn't a person making a choice. I was a solution. Over the next few weeks, the pressure didn't come all at once. It came in polite waves. My mom would call and casually mention Melissa's excitement. My dad would bring up how competitive the housing market was and how timing was everything. Melissa would forward listings she liked, complete with comments like, "This one's perfect, right?" Each message carried the same unspoken assumption. This was happening. I tried to push back gently at first. I explained again that the amount they wanted was more than I could realistically give without putting myself at risk. My mom sighed like I was being dramatic. "Dean, you're single. You don't have kids. You'll bounce back." That sentence stayed with me. "You'll bounce back." Like I was a rubber ball, not a person. Like my stability was less important because no one else depended on me. Meanwhile, I started noticing other things. Small things that added up. My parents had quietly paid for upgrades on Melissa's future place. Inspections, consultations, fees. Things they could afford but had apparently decided not to cover fully because, in my dad's words, everyone should contribute. Everyone, in this case, meant me. At a family dinner one Sunday, Melissa talked openly about how lucky she was to have such supportive parents. She thanked them repeatedly. She didn't look at me once. Not even when my mom added. And of course, Dean's pitching in too. Family sticks together. I felt like I was watching myself from the outside. Smiling, nodding, playing along. Inside, something was tightening, coiling up slowly. The breaking point didn't come from one big argument. It came from a series of realizations that stacked on top of each other until I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. A week later, my car finally gave up. The repair estimate was bad. Really bad. I called my dad, partly for advice, partly because some naive part of me still hoped he'd say, "Focus on yourself first." Instead, he said, "That's unfortunate timing. Just don't let this interfere with the commitment we discussed." Commitment. Like I'd signed something. I hung up and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, feeling this sharp, almost physical sense of betrayal. They knew I was struggling. They knew I was stretched thin. And still, the priority wasn't my stability. It was keeping Melissa comfortable. That night, I opened my banking app and looked at my savings. The number was modest, but it represented years of discipline. Saying no to trips, driving an old car, working late nights. It wasn't just money. It was proof that I could take care of myself. And they wanted it. Not because they needed it to survive, but because it made things easier for them. I decided I needed clarity. Not hints. Not gentle deflection. Real answers. So I asked for another sit-down. When I arrived, they were already prepared. Papers on the table. Numbers written down. A printed breakdown of costs. I should have realized then how far ahead they'd planned without me. "I can't give that amount," I said, finally firm. "It would put me in a bad position." My mom frowned. "You're exaggerating." "I'm not," I said. "I've shown you my numbers." My dad tapped the paper. "You have savings." "For emergencies," I replied. My mom smiled thinly. "This is an emergency." For Melissa, that was it. That was the moment my patience snapped into something colder and clearer. "So my emergencies don't count?" I asked. My dad's voice hardened. "Dean, don't make this about you." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It is about me. It's my money." The room went quiet. I'd crossed an invisible line. The tone shifted immediately. "You're being selfish," my mom said. "After everything we've done for you." I wanted to ask what that was. The early independence? The emotional distance? The lectures instead of help? But I held it back. "I'm asking for boundaries," I said. "That's not selfish." My dad leaned forward. "We raised you better than this." That one hurt, because it implied that disagreement was failure, that obedience was virtue. Then came the betrayal. The thing that, even now, still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. My mom reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "We didn't want to do this," she said. "But since you're being difficult, we need to be transparent." She slid the folder across the table. Inside were documents. Financial ones. Old ones. Statements. Transfers. Records. Things I recognized. Money I'd given them years ago. Not loans. Gifts. Help when they said they needed it. Emergency contributions. Support I'd offered freely, believing it was temporary. My dad looked me dead in the eye and said, "You already owe us. This just balances things out." I felt the air leave my lungs. They hadn't forgotten. They'd kept track, not as gratitude, as leverage. In that moment, I understood everything. This wasn't about helping Melissa. This was about control, about settling imaginary scores, about reminding me that no matter how independent I thought I was, they still believed they owned a claim on my life. I closed the folder slowly, my hands shaking just enough that they noticed. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a line in the sand. And whichever side I chose next was going to change everything. I left their house that night without another word. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I finally understood that nothing I said would matter. The folder sat heavy in my hands as I walked to my car, like physical proof that I'd never actually been a son to them in the way I thought I was. I was an asset, a contingency plan, a backup wallet they could open whenever it suited them. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the streets or the traffic lights. I just remember this hollow feeling in my chest, like something essential had been pulled out, and I hadn't noticed until it was gone. I'd spent years telling myself that my parents were fair, just a little old-fashioned, a little emotionally stiff. That night killed that illusion completely. For the next few weeks, everything unraveled quietly. I didn't announce that I was pulling away. I didn't make some dramatic declaration about cutting contact. I just stopped engaging. I stopped responding immediately. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped showing up to Sunday dinners with forced smiles and half-truths about how I was doing. And in return, the tone of their messages changed. My mom started sending guilt-laced texts. "We're just worried about you. Families help each other. Your sister is under so much stress right now." My dad's messages were shorter, colder. Practical. We need an answer. Deadlines don't wait. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Melissa didn't reach out at all. Not once. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to check in after what she knew had been a tense conversation. The silence from her hurt more than the pressure from my parents. It confirmed what I already suspected. As long as the outcome favored her, my feelings were irrelevant. At the same time, my own life started slipping. The car repair wiped out what little buffer I had left. I dipped into my savings just to stay afloat. I started skipping meals without really meaning to, telling myself I wasn't hungry when the truth was I was anxious. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights I crashed from exhaustion. Other nights I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs for so long. There was a stretch of about 2 weeks where I genuinely felt like I was failing at adulthood. Not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, creeping way where everything feels fragile. One missed paycheck, one unexpected expense, one wrong decision. And through all of that, the folder sat on my desk. I didn't open it again at first. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside. But just knowing it was there felt like a weight. Like a reminder that my generosity had been cataloged, reduced to numbers, stripped of context. One night, after another tense call with my dad where he reminded me that time was running out, I finally hit a wall. I sat on the edge of my bed and just stared at the floor. No phone, no distractions, just me and the reality I'd been avoiding. I realized something uncomfortable in that moment. I was exhausted because I'd spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of respect from people who benefited from me not having any boundaries. That thought didn't magically fix anything, but it did shift something internally. It made me angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not explosive anger, focused anger. The next day, I did something small but important. I booked an appointment with a financial advisor. Not because I suddenly had extra money to invest, but because I needed someone objective to tell me where I stood without emotional baggage attached. I needed facts, not family narratives. Sitting in that office, laying out my situation to a stranger, was strangely grounding. No judgment, no guilt, just numbers and options. You're stretched, she told me honestly, but you're not irresponsible. And you're definitely not in a position to take on someone else's major expense. Hearing that out loud felt like permission to trust my own instincts again. I started making changes. Quiet ones. I cut unnecessary expenses ruthlessly. I renegotiated a few bills. I took on an extra freelance contract that I'd been hesitant to accept before because it meant more late nights. I told myself it was temporary. A way to stabilize. A way to breathe. I also stopped answering my parents' calls for a while. That was harder than the financial stuff. Every unanswered call came with a spike of anxiety. Every ignored message felt like I was breaking some unwritten rule. But the space gave me clarity. For the first time, my decisions weren't being filtered through what they would think or expect. Something else happened during that period that I didn't anticipate. I started feeling lighter. Not happier exactly, but steadier. More grounded. I woke up knowing that the day's stress would come from my own responsibilities, not from managing other people's disappointment. A month passed. Then 2. My parents' messages shifted again. Less demanding. More confused. My mom started asking if I was okay. My dad asked if I'd given any more thought to the situation. I responded politely but vaguely. Still figuring things out. Focusing on work right now. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. Melissa finally texted me after almost 3 months of silence. Are you mad at me? I stared at that message for a long time. There were a dozen responses I could have sent. Sarcastic ones. Angry ones. Long explanations. I typed and deleted several drafts before settling on something simple. I'm taking care of myself right now. She didn't reply. Around that time, something unexpected happened at work. One of my freelance clients referred me to a larger project. Bigger scope. Better pay. Long-term potential. It wasn't life-changing money overnight, but it was stability. It was momentum. I poured myself into it. Late nights. Early mornings. Focused effort. For the first time in months, the work felt rewarding instead of draining. I wasn't just surviving, I was building again. My savings stopped shrinking. Slowly, it started growing. My stress didn't disappear, but it became manageable. I felt capable again. And with that came something even more important. Self-respect. I stopped viewing myself as the difficult one for saying no. I stopped replaying my parents' accusations in my head. I saw them for what they were, tools to maintain control. The folder came out again one evening. This time, I opened it calmly. I went through every page carefully. Dates, amounts, context. I remembered the circumstances around each contribution, the emergencies, the promises, the gratitude that had existed in the moment and vanished later. I realized then that they hadn't kept those records to protect themselves. They'd kept them to use against me if they ever needed to. That understanding didn't crush me like it would have months earlier. Instead, it clarified something crucial. They thought they had leverage. They didn't realize that by showing me exactly how they viewed our relationship, they'd given me something far more valuable than guilt. They'd given me certainty. And as my life slowly stabilized and my confidence returned, I started to see the situation not as a crisis, but as a turning point. I wasn't at the end of the story yet, not even close. But for the first time since that night at their kitchen table, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Once my footing felt solid again, the way I looked at my family changed completely. Not in a dramatic, villain origin way. It was quieter than that. Colder. Like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the full composition instead of the single brushstrokes that used to confuse you. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was observing. The first thing I did was stop explaining myself entirely. That sounds small, but for someone like me, it was massive. I'd spent my entire adult life justifying my choices to my parents. Where I lived, how I spent my money, why I said yes or no to things. Once I stopped offering explanations, their reactions became interesting. My mom started calling more frequently, but the tone was different, less confident. She'd open with casual questions, then slowly steer the conversation toward finances, Melissa's situation, or how tight things were becoming. I'd listen. I'd respond politely. I'd give nothing away. My dad tried a different approach. He became reasonable, or at least what he thought reasonable looked like. He framed things as discussions instead of demands. "We just want to find a solution that works for everyone," he said during one call, as if the previous months hadn't happened. I agreed with him, calmly. "So do I." That answer seemed to unsettle him more than outright refusal ever had. Behind the scenes, I started doing something I should have done years earlier. I started documenting everything. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. I saved messages. I noted dates and times of conversations. I wrote down what was said, who said it, and how it was framed. I didn't know exactly what I'd need it for yet, but instinct told me that clarity was my ally now. I also revisited those old financial records with a more critical eye. I noticed something I'd missed before, back when guilt had fogged my thinking. Several of the amounts my parents claimed I owed them were either misrepresented or outright false. Money I'd given freely had been reframed as advances. Help I'd offered during emergencies had been rewritten as obligations. That realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me cautious. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer, not to start a war, just to understand my position. I brought the folder. I brought my notes. I explained the situation without embellishment. He listened quietly, then said something that stuck with me. "They're counting on your emotional compliance," he said. "Legally, they don't have much. But emotionally, they think you'll fold." That sentence felt like someone turning on a light. Over the next few weeks, I started setting boundaries in ways that couldn't be argued with. I didn't announce them. I lived them. When my mom asked if I could temporarily cover one of Melissa's expenses, I said, "No, that doesn't work for me," and changed the subject. When my dad hinted that deadlines were approaching, I responded, "I'm aware," and left it at that. They didn't know how to handle that version of me. The version that didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't react. Melissa, on the other hand, started to panic. She reached out again, this time with longer messages. She talked about stress, about pressure, about how our parents were on her constantly. She framed herself as caught in the middle, as if she hadn't benefited from every single decision made so far. I listened. I sympathized. I still didn't commit to anything. That's when she made her mistake. One evening, she called me instead of texting. Her voice was tight, rehearsed. "I just need to know," she said. "Are you going to help or not? Because Mom and Dad already told the realtor you're covering part of the down payment." There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not confusion. A confirmed assumption presented as fact. I thanked her for telling me. Calmly. Almost pleasantly. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. Not shaking. Not spiraling. Just thinking. They had made commitments on my behalf. financial ones, to third parties, without my consent. That wasn't just entitlement anymore. That was recklessness. And for the first time, I saw a path forward that didn't involve yelling or dramatic ultimatums. It involved letting them feel the consequences of their own assumptions. I waited. That was the hardest part. Not reacting immediately, letting things progress naturally while I quietly prepared. I continued building my financial cushion. I secured the long-term contract at work. I updated my budget. I made sure that if things escalated, I wouldn't be scrambling. Stability was my shield now. At the same time, I started reconnecting with people I'd unintentionally sidelined over the years. Friends, colleagues, people who knew me outside the context of family roles. Talking to them reminded me who I was when I wasn't being managed or minimized. One of those friends worked in real estate law. Over coffee, I casually mentioned my situation. I didn't ask for advice directly. I just listened as he talked through common scenarios. People get into trouble when they assume funding, he said, especially when that funding isn't formalized. I nodded, filed that away. My parents' behavior grew more erratic as deadlines approached. My mom oscillated between sweetness and subtle threats. I don't know how we'll explain this to Melissa if you back out. My dad started referencing family reputation and trust. I kept my responses consistent. Neutral, calm, non-committal. Inside, though, I was aligning pieces. I knew the exact date Melissa planned to make her offer. I knew which realtor she was working with. I knew what my parents had promised and, more importantly, what they hadn't actually secured. They believed pressure would force me into compliance at the last minute. They believed I'd cave rather than embarrass them. They were wrong. I didn't want revenge fueled by anger. I wanted something cleaner, something that would expose the truth without me having to raise my voice. And then, just days before everything was supposed to be finalized, my dad sent me a message that confirmed I'd timed this perfectly. We've assured everyone you're in. Don't make us look foolish. I stared at that sentence for a long time, not because it scared me, but because it proved, beyond any doubt, that this had never been about family. It had always been about image, control, and the assumption that I would sacrifice quietly so they wouldn't have to explain themselves. I set my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and took a slow breath. They thought the next move was mine because they'd cornered me. What they didn't realize was that the corner they'd pushed me into was exactly where I needed to be. Everything was in place now. I just had to decide when to let it unfold. The morning everything collapsed, I woke up calm. Not the shaky, forced calm I'd been pretending to have for months, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you already know how something is going to end and you've made peace with it. I didn't rush. I made coffee. I reviewed my notes one last time. Then I waited. By mid-morning, my phone started lighting up. First it was my mom. Call me. Urgent. I didn't. Then my dad. We need to talk. Now. I let it ring. The third call was from a number I didn't recognize. I let that one go to voicemail too. I wasn't being petty. I was being precise. An hour later, Melissa called. She sounded panicked in a way I'd never heard before. Her voice cracked halfway through the first sentence. Dean, what's going on? The realtor says the funds aren't confirmed. Mom and Dad said you already transferred. I interrupted her gently. I never agreed to that. Silence. You what? She asked. I never agreed to fund anything, I said calmly. I told you I was taking care of myself right now. I never authorized a transfer. I never signed anything. She started talking faster, words tumbling over each other. Deadlines. Deposits. Commitments. How embarrassing this was going to be. How everyone was waiting. I listened until she ran out of breath. Then I said, that sounds like something you should talk to Mom and Dad about. She hung up on me. That was when I finally called my parents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I simply asked them to explain, slowly, how they'd assured third parties of money that wasn't theirs to promise. My dad tried to bulldoze through it at first. He talked about expectations, about family obligations, about how I was putting everyone in a terrible position. I let him finish. Then I said, I told you no. Repeatedly. You chose to ignore that because you assumed pressure would work. My mom tried a different angle. Tears. Guilt. How could I do this to my sister? How could I let things get this far? That wasn't my doing, I replied. That was yours. She gasped like I'd slapped her. I documented everything. I continued, still calm. Every message. Every call. Every time I said I wasn't committing. I also spoke to a lawyer. And if anyone suggests, even indirectly, that I'm legally responsible for this situation. I'll defend myself accordingly. The line went dead quiet. That was the moment the power shifted. Not because I threatened them, but because they finally realized I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't confused. I was prepared. What happened next unfolded quickly, and none of it required me to lift a finger. The realtor demanded confirmation of funds. There were none. The offer fell through. Fees that my parents had confidently brushed off suddenly became very real expenses they were responsible for. Melissa lost the place she'd already started calling home. And for the first time in my life, I watched my parents scramble. They tried to save face. They tried to rewrite the story. My dad told extended family that there had been a misunderstanding. My mom told friends that the market was just too competitive. Melissa avoided me entirely. A week later, my parents asked to meet. I agreed on my terms. We sat at the same kitchen table where they'd once told me money wasn't everything. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. They didn't bring folders this time. No documents. No leverage. Just regret wrapped in defensiveness. My dad started with an apology that wasn't quite an apology. We didn't expect things to escalate like this. I did, I said quietly. My mom cried. Real tears this time. She said they'd only wanted what was best for the family. That they'd assumed I'd understand. You assumed, I replied, that I'd sacrifice quietly so you wouldn't have to adjust. They didn't deny it. That was the moment I told them everything. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just honestly. I told them how invisible I'd felt growing up. How independence had become a burden instead of a strength. How being reliable had turned into being exploitable. I told them how close I'd come to burning myself out trying to meet expectations that were never applied evenly. They listened. For the first time, they really listened. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't ask them to make things right. I simply laid out my boundaries. I won't be funding other people's lives, I said. I won't be used as a fallback plan. And if that means our relationship changes, then so be it. My dad nodded slowly. My mom wiped her eyes. Melissa didn't speak to me for months after that. When she finally did, it wasn't to apologize. It was to tell me she'd moved into a smaller place, one she could actually afford. There was resentment in her voice, but also something else. Reality. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were awkward holidays, stiff conversations, a new distance that took time to navigate. But something fundamental had changed. They stopped asking. They stopped assuming. And most importantly, I stopped explaining. The money I protected didn't just rebuild my savings. It rebuilt my sense of self. I advanced at work. I stabilized. I planned a future that wasn't built around compensating for someone else's expectations. The last thing my dad ever said to me about that situation still echoes in my head. We didn't realize how much we were asking of you. I looked at him and replied, You did. You just didn't think it would cost you anything. I left that house that day lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped losing myself to keep everyone else comfortable.